Liberalism is a political and moral philosophy that significantly influences the world as we see it today. Its ideas and principles are evident in various aspects of human life, from the way that states are governed and how the economy works, to the actions of individual people and the moral decisions they make. With its dawn in the 17th century, liberalism put forward a new set of ideas relating to human morality that were based on individual freedom. Liberalism was to provide an objective system of organizing in which different cultures, religions, and points of view can peacefully coexist. It later proved to be a useful tool in the fight for civil rights, gender equality, social justice, and freedom of religion and thought, emphasizing the toleration and acceptance of all people on the sole basis of their humanity. More recently, however, modern liberalism has presented many limitations in its application within society, and has proven to fall short in harmonizing the rights and interests of different communities and individuals. Though it has provided grounds for the growth of many progressive social movements, it has raised major challenges for individuals and communities that hold alternative beliefs and values.
You have not supported the 300 parents who have been protesting here for the last 4 weeks. Where have you been?
They've allowed parents to think that parents tell schools what to do, and parents tell schools which books they can have, which books they can't have, what they can say, what they can't say.
Today, more than ever before, the LGBTQ people have made notable progress in the campaign for increased recognition and representation, especially across the Western world, as reflected in the media and numerous government policies. Liberal ideas first emerged in the 17th century, based on the writings of John Locke, a famous English philosopher who was known as the father of liberalism. He presented a political challenge to religious governance, arguing that it's wrong for governments to force their citizens to conform to a particular religion, and called for religious freedom and the separation of church and state. Governments should tolerate diverse religious beliefs, unless the practice of those beliefs directly threaten the public order. Locke's ideas sowed the seeds for the secularization of Europe and the eventual rise of liberalism as the prevailing moral, political, social, and economic framework, pushing Christianity to the periphery. Liberalism developed into a distinct movement during the Enlightenment period in the 18th and 19th centuries, when it became popular among Western philosophers and political theorists such as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill.
During the 19th century, a thinker, say like John Stuart Mill, argues for liberalism on the basis of what would make for the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. And Mill wanted to argue that these large-scale consequences would work out well, provided that you had sensible laws and so on, if people were allowed to take decisions for themselves. And in this context, he emphasized the significance of what he called individuality. The idea really that there could be benefits not just to the individuals concerned, but to society as a whole, if people were able to try out their own ideas, to do their own thing, not in ways that harmed other people, but where people shouldn't be criticized for being eccentric.
Classical liberalism has evolved into its more modern incarnation, known as social liberalism. Both classical and social liberalism are united on the basic principle of individual freedom, or individualism. Individualism emphasizes the freedom of a person from any restraints on their actions, thoughts, and beliefs imposed by an external entity, such as that of religion. In essence, it provides each individual with the capacity to live their own life according to their own reasons and motives, provided that the consequences do not cause harm to others.
Liberalism has meant different things in different contexts, so it's often regarded as something that's, going against the established order. Although in the context in the Western context, we're really, I suppose, when we're talking about liberalism, now referring to social liberalism. And you could really define that as being the rejection of the Judeo-Christian morality, which underpinned our society and Western civilization for so long. So particularly in the area of sexual relations, so the idea of the family being the basic unit of society, which is itself formed by a man and a woman in a lifelong union. Certainly in the past 4 or 5 decades, since the 1960s, what's known as the countercultural movement, that's been seen as too restrictive. And so what became known as the permissive society was really promoted as a new form of freedom and self-discovery.
The liberal agenda is about re-establishing secularism, secular humanism in the world. It's anti-theistic, irrespective of whatever faith background you come from. It wants to only talk about empiricism, so there is no consciousness or awareness of anything in the spiritual realm. And I think that all of the world religions, as far as I understand, are at least united in this one thing, that there are sexual values that are very important to the way in which people live their lives.
Activism in the UK surrounding decriminalisation, partial decriminalisation for male homosexual acts in the 1950s and 1960s really centred on liberal principles. It really focused on the rights of freeborn Englishmen to conduct themselves in their own homes in private as they would wish without doing any harm to others. So it was really based on liberal values and liberal expectations of people's role in society as good citizens. There was no sense that this was to be a radical transformation of society or to increase tolerance toward homosexual men, but rather extending the rights that all citizens had in a liberal state. After decriminalization, the movement that saw itself as the most radical was the Gay Liberation Front. And they called for the radical transformation of society. They wanted not just tolerance of gay men and lesbians, but they wanted society to transform completely. They wanted to completely transform how we engaged with the state, how we engaged with family. They called for the dissolution of the nuclear family as a potential site of homophobia. They wanted absolute and complete change. They emerged around 1970 and lasted just a few years, but their impact continues, because I think a lot of activism that we see today that wants to see more radical change can trace its origins, at least in the UK, to a lot of the activism that was initiated by the Gay Liberation Front. And we're actually approaching their own 50th anniversary. So the living members of the original Gay Liberation Front, many of them still remain quite active in, I suppose, what some of them would define as queer politics and queer activism now.
Since the 1960s, male homosexuality in private has been made legal. There were then various different tendencies within thought about particularly gay men. You got, on the one side, people writing, celebrating experimentation with sexuality in all different kinds, and gay men saying that they shouldn't be forced into a stereotype drawn from the relations of heterosexual people. You then subsequently got people arguing that, well, actually, legal recognition of gay relationships would be positive both for the people and for society. Because, for example, Andrew Sullivan, in a book of his called Virtually Normal, argued a kind of conservative case for this, saying, look, if there are gay men, then it is surely much better if they are in stable relationships, that if these are recognized, so that if you're employed somewhere and spouses are invited, that you can actually take and have recognized your spouse, that this serves to bind people into better kinds of relationships rather than disapproving of anything of a settled character and sort of pushing people towards more promiscuous behavior and so on. And you have then got the demand for gay and lesbian marriage. And this is now recognized, it's the law. It's not clear that anyone is going to try and push back on this now.
60 seconds ago, Westminster, and a dramatic result in the vote on gay marriage. This was the Commons as they came to vote right now. Let's hear it.
Ayes to the right, 400. The noes to the left, 175. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Neil MacDonald has more on this decision. Neil.
Yeah, you know, David, 12 years ago, gay sex was actually against the law just across the river from here in Virginia. As of today, gay marriage is a legal right in this country, everywhere in this country.
Today's ruling felt inevitable. It was, nonetheless, the greatest expansion of marriage since the 1967 decision that struck down bans on interracial matrimony. It was a clear and historic declaration.
That the four words etched onto the front of the Supreme Court, equal justice under law, apply to us too.
I would probably, at least in the British context, think about pre-decriminalization activism that we would typically call homophile activism. That was a very single issue that was focusing on legal change, that was focusing on decriminalization as the first step, possibly toward more radical change. And I'd contrast that with post-decriminalization, more radical change, like the Gay Liberation Front, that sought to have a greater transformation of society, that they weren't happy with just legal change, thank you very much, I've got my rights, but instead wanted to have the state fully recognize the diversity of people, the full diversity of people, and recognizing that we're not just living in binaries of male and female, of gay and straight, and recognizing that society is far more complex and complicated. And actually these questions go beyond legal issues and the state, but they go to families, they go to churches, they go to communities, they go all over beyond just legal recognition.
LGBTQ activism has come a long way since the legalization of homosexuality in the 1960s. From achieving civil rights and the right to healthcare, to same-sex marriage and housing rights. Today, the movement is still working to combat prejudice and hate crime against LGBTQ people and promote greater acceptance and representation. There is growing recognition of the place that the LGBTQ community hold within society and awareness surrounding the discrimination that they have been subject to for so long. Key milestones in the fight for LGBTQ rights have become widely celebrated, with February marking LGBTQ History Month and June, which marks Pride Month every year. Public events and rallies are held to celebrate the impact of LGBTQ people in the world, with many businesses and government institutions joining in solidarity.
With regard to gay pride events and things of this kind, the situation looks to me to be a bit more tricky because, often what was involved was behaviour of a kind which might go on in nightclubs and so on. And the notion that everyone should be supposed to celebrate this, that this actually represents the image of all people who are gay and lesbian. So it seems to me personally that the more traditional liberal approach would be to say, look, recognise relationships, and that's also important because, say, if someone is run over by a bus, if they're taken off to hospital, if someone is in a relationship with someone but it isn't legally recognized, then they can't go in to visit them. And there were all sorts of facets of people's lives which were problematic from that point of view. So just given that society is pluralistic, given that I guess we want broadly to be humanitarian, it's something which it seems in the kind of society that we've got is desirable.
The relationship between the LGBTQ community and religious communities can vary greatly across time and place. Throughout history, many acts of violence against LGBTQ people have been carried out in the name of religion.
Morning hours here in Orlando, a massacre at a gay nightclub right here behind me. You can see the sign, it's black and white, just over my shoulder here. And at the center of it all, a lone gunman who, in the middle of that massacre, called 911 to pledge allegiance to ISIS.
God, honor, motherland, they chanted. Wearing obscene anti-gay t-shirts, some hardcore right-wingers were intent on violence. Following their lead, thousands of people from Bialystok, including senior citizens, lambasted marchers protesting against the sudden rise of so-called LGBT-free zones. When Poland's populist Law and Justice Party came to power in 2015, it declared ambitions to Christianize the European Union. In towns like Bialystok, they abhor what they regard as mainstream Europe's decadent values.
The majority of traditional interpretations of the Abrahamic faiths are unanimous in that homosexual acts are forbidden under the law of God. Though, as within any community and religious denomination, there are a diversity of viewpoints regarding this issue. Generally, religious communities strive to promote love, compassion, and tolerance towards all people on the basis of their shared humanity.
Faith communities have been really proactive in many cases in supporting LGBTQ activism, and their membership certainly has no homogenous view, so there can be fantastic support for LGBTQ communities' activism and rights from within faith communities, even though our stereotype is very often of faith communities as being oppressive and homophobic.
I think that in a liberal society, there would be an argument, look, however much you think that these people are badly mistaken and that their views are misleading and so on, you have to accord them the same kind of rights as everyone else has, and you have to bring members of your community to an understanding that this is the case. At the same time, it seems to me that it's perfectly possible for a community to say, look, we believe that these views are deeply wrong and very bad for people, even though we're committed by the law, if we're living in this country, to respect them. This doesn't mean that we have to approve of them, this doesn't mean that we have to celebrate them, but we're not allowed to engage in certain kinds of forms of discrimination against them.
I shared my house with a lovely gay guy who died of AIDS. He has the right to have his life, to live his life as he feels is right. Fair enough. However, see what the LGBT do is, and this isn't my lovely friend. We agreed to disagree. He was my friend. He was, in many ways, he was an old-fashioned liberal, and now I'd like to talk about two different things. Liberalism is, I'm LGBT, or I'm pro-abortion up to birth, or I'm whatever, okay? It's views I wouldn't at all espouse. I think they are dead wrong on many counts, but people have the right to have them and argue for them in the public square. I'm not fighting liberalism now. I'm fighting progressivism. Liberals look at me and go, you're wrong, but you have the right to your view, particularly if you have evidence. Yes, you're arguing for it in the public square, etc. So that's liberalism. So I disagree fundamentally, but we agree that I have the right to be there and they have the right to be there. It's a free society. Progressives, however, go, no. You're not just wrong, you're evil because you hurt the LGBT community. Okay, so they want to basically silence me or punish me. And that is what we're increasingly seeing is you don't have the right to have another view.
One needs to take a step back from some of the modern aspects of liberalism and to say, look, if you are going to have a genuine pluralism, then you have to, on the one side, make sure that everyone is respecting some rather basic things, but on the other hand, to make sure that what they're being asked to respect is rather basic and is compatible with the recognition that the society is a pluralistic one, not one where everyone has to subscribe to a particular modern understanding of liberalism and what's involved in it.
A beautiful little girl, I'll show you her photo, 10 years of age. She asked if she could be excused from the LGBT pride in her school, a London school. She's put on maximum exclusion 5 days, and her life is absolutely made hell by the headmistress in terms of love and acceptance of all. See, the deal is it isn't loving and accepting of all. No, no, no. You've got to sign on or you deserve to be punished.
The older liberalism emphasized the significance of toleration of things that you didn't actually like. Whereas now, if we're supposed to be celebrating everything, then there can be a big problem if there's a clash between that and someone's religious beliefs. I mean, clearly, if you get a traditionally minded Christian and a traditionally minded Muslim, they would really say, look, there are big problems about each faith. From the Christian perspective, the teachings of Islam are following a false prophet, whereas from a Muslim perspective, Christians have actually misunderstood the truth that was given to them, misunderstand utterly the significance of Jesus and so on. And so they might, in a liberal society, have, in a way, rather grudgingly to say, well, we have to respect their freedoms. But the notion of having to celebrate one another can be difficult, and this obviously can be tricky too when you get into issues of behavior which conservative people in all of the Abrahamic faiths may think, well, really aren't to be celebrated at all. They may be things in a liberal society where we're obliged to tolerate these things, but the notion that we should be celebrating them is a problem.
We have this progressivism that we have moved from decriminalization to toleration, to acceptance, to celebration, to forced participation. You'll wear the rainbow lanyard or you'll pay. And if you don't, then you deserve punishment. Now, see, I'm saying, stop. This is not a free society.
We know from the official government's own statistics, the Office of National Statistics, that those who identify as LGBT are only about 1.9% of the population, and yet in the BBC, I believe they're about 8%, and they've got targets for an even higher representation as well. So basically, in the media, people who identify as LGBT are about 4 or 5 times more overrepresented than they are in the general population. So they're wielding very much disproportionate power and influence, and that's affecting our programming. Even children's television as well is starting to promote this agenda.
Historically, homosexuality was considered officially as a psychiatric problem that required help from a mental health specialist. However, in the 1970s, gay activists lobbied against this theory, rejecting it as a major contributor to the widespread anti-gay social stigma, and brought awareness to modern sexuality research that disputed this idea. The activist protests succeeded in gaining the attention of the American Psychiatric Association, who then began the discussion on the official removal of homosexuality from its Manual of Mental Health Disorders, called the DSM. A research paper published in 2015 by the MDPI in its Behavioral Sciences journal provides an extensive historical account of this process. Robert Spitzer, who led the association's subcommittee looking into this issue, reviews the characteristics of various mental health disorders and concluded that they all regularly cause significant distress or were associated with difficulties in social functioning. Having arrived at this definition of mental disorder, the committee agreed that homosexuality per se does not fall within it. Regardless, some psychiatrists from the psychiatric community objected to the decision to remove it from the list of disorders and called for a referendum. The association held a vote amongst its members in which a majority of 58% voted in favour of the decision and 42% voted to oppose it. Thereafter, homosexuality was officially removed from the manual. But there are still a diverse range of psychiatric theories which suggest alternative ideas. Today, the standard of psychotherapy in the US and Europe is gay affirmative, which means gay people are encouraged to accept their sexual orientation. The British Psychological Society's guidelines for psychologists working with gender, sexuality, and relationship diversity encourage psychologists to integrate an affirmative stance to their practice when working with LGBTQ clients.
As a young man, I was conflicted in this area, so I was drawn to people of the same sex, but that produced a tremendous amount of guilt and shame and I guess, discomfort in terms of me functioning as a person. I married and genuinely married. It was a loving relationship, and I'm still in the same relationship after many years, but the conflict wasn't dealt with. I had a Christian conversion. I was converted to Christianity, and for a while things were good in my life. But there came a time when I realized that actually these issues were not completely dealt with. And that had the effect of shaming me even more deeply, because I thought, well, I can't be much of a Christian then if I am still having these experiences. So to cut a very long story short, eventually I knew that I needed to get help in this area, and I went to a professional psychologist, to a psychotherapist eventually, and those individuals helped me to explore this issue and to see that actually what was happening was that this was like a symptom. It was speaking out of my life, so to speak, and it was indicative of some unresolved emotional issues that I was trying to resolve in the wrong way, or in a way that was making me increasingly unhappy. And once I realized that actually this is not a sexual problem, it's an emotional issue. And these emotional issues are masking, or they are hidden behind these sexual desires. And once you begin to deal with the emotional issues, then what I found was that the sexual issues began to dissipate. So in my family of origin, eventually in my life, I realized that the older brother that I lost, I'd always been told that his name was John. That's what my parents had told me. But later on, when my mother was older, before she died, she told me that actually his name was Michael. And it's difficult to explain what that knowledge did for me, but basically what it taught me was I was a replacement child. So my parents lost my older brother when he was a baby. And what I know, because I've listened to the stories, was that my father was very invested in that child. loved that child deeply. But when I came, I think it was a threat. You know, it was difficult for him to now again invest in me. So what happened was, it was almost like he gave me to my mother, and I was my mother's son. And because of that, what I sensed was I didn't get the connection and the bonding and the belonging and the sense of identity that young men need to get from their fathers and from the male community to make them feel that they're a part of that tribe. And there was confusion on that level. But when I realized that, and I saw that actually there were reasons for why these things were happening in my life, that was tremendously liberating and freeing.
Although highly controversial, there are some organizations that offer psychotherapeutic help for LGBTQ people who are unhappy with their lifestyle and are seeking to change their homosexual feelings or gender dysphoria. Dr. Mike Davidson is the director of Core Issues Trust, an organization which affirms that human sexuality is fluid for some and can therefore be changed in some cases.
Core Issues Trust was incorporated in 2011. It started in 2017, and really it was in response to the fact that it was difficult to find help. So as a man myself who was looking for help in that area, I found it difficult to do that, and I wanted to be able to give back some of the help that I did eventually find. I was helped by some professionals who took me seriously and allowed me to work out the issues that were concerning me. And because they took me seriously, I was able to find, I guess, a potential that enabled me to live my life in the way that I wanted to do that. So we're very passionate about the fact that we think that people should have the right and the freedom to identify the way that they want to. And if for whatever reason they're unhappy with homosexual practices or gender confusions, we think society really needs to take that seriously. They need to be treated with respect and not simply told to get on with being gay because that's the way they were born.
What Mike Davidson does is he uses standard psychotherapeutic methods to help go down the layers to why. Why am I gay? Why am I attracted to women if I'm a woman, or if I'm a man to men? Why? The same with the trans stuff. Why do I feel I'm born in the wrong body?
I think one thing that we've learned in Core Issues Trust, and obviously in the IFTCC, is that actually some people's values, they might be religious values or social conservative values, are actually more primary than other aspects in terms of how they might live out their sexual experience. And when there's a conflict, it's those underlying values that are very important to them. And we want to respect people who come. And it, you know, whether they come from a non-faith background, an other faith background, or a Christian background, we feel it's important to see the individuals for who they are and to work with them to achieve the goals that they have.
See, it's really important psychological work. And again, I've said many of these folks are total victims. They didn't ask to feel like this. Like they wanted this like a hole in the head. They really, like, this has cursed my life. So that's why Mike's stuff is so important. You know, conversion therapy, of course, the government, they label something, they give it a spin. It's pure BBC. It's like, stop, we don't do this. We have never done this. And we believe in client autonomy. If a client says, I choose to pursue my heterosexual potential, I ought to have that right. I can be gay. Everyone goes, oh, great, they're gay. Fine. It's, again, a level playing field. If you want this, you ought to have the right to have this. But equally, if you want the other, you ought to have that right.
What we found very often is that people come to us and they say, well, I went to the psychologist, I went to the psychiatrist, and they simply told me that gay is who you are, that's how you were born. And then they tell us why it doesn't satisfy them, why they don't buy that. Some have been abused when they were children, and that pushed them into this direction. They can actually remember a time when they were attracted to the opposite sex. Then this thing happened, and we're not talking about everybody, but some of them, this is the reality. And when that happened, it seriously disturbed them. And I think our concern is that we live in a time when the government wants to ban therapeutic support.
In the UK, all major counselling and psychotherapy bodies, as well as the NHS, have condemned what is referred to as conversion therapy, claiming that it's a dangerous practice and that its effects are potentially harmful. Stonewall, the largest LGBTQ rights organisation in the UK and Europe, has called for governments to publicly condemn conversion therapy and take further steps to ensure that it's unavailable everywhere.
It's very interesting in Britain that the gay lobby and those who would support them in this call for a ban talk about potential harm. They don't talk about harm, well, some of them perhaps do, but in official documents and for those who are perhaps more articulate, they usually talk about potential harm. And I think it's really important to unpack that. Because I think the fact is, you won't find peer-reviewed journal articles that show categorically that on average, in counselling situations, this is always going to be harmful. The research is just not there. And if you go to the APA, the American Psychological Association, the largest psychological association in the world, in 2009, in probably the most thorough research document that had been done, certainly at that point and way beyond, clearly says that there is not the research one way or the other. So, there is no research that proves that it's harmful, and there's no research that proves that it's not harmful. And therefore, we cannot say categorically that it is harmful. We have to say it's potentially harmful.
All professional psychological bodies in the UK believe it to be an ethical offence for any of its members to be involved in changing unwanted sexual feelings. This has raised major problems for people who are voluntarily seeking therapy to resolve their same-sex attraction.
Paracetamol is actually lethal, but we don't ban it, we regulate it. You can't buy more than, 16 in a shop, or 32, I can't remember what it is. And we set up ways of functioning because we know that this substance can actually end a person's life. But we know that there is value in this substance, and therefore, we regulate it and we use it. And I think it needs to be the same thing when it comes to therapeutic intervention. If you ban it, you drive it underground, there is then no control, there is no accountability, there is no professionalism, there's nothing. So you regulate it, and you make sure that those who provide this service are properly qualified and are working according to an ethical framework. And that's what the International Federation for Therapeutic and Counselling Choice aims to do.
I would say to Stonewall, fine, you show me how you are including all these other minorities. Well, of course they won't. In fact, I have publicly challenged their leaders. They don't like that one bit because they know society isn't ready for it, yes? So I say, stop. You discriminate too. Let's just be honest about it. I draw my line here, you draw your line there. You don't include everyone. It's fascinating. The once gay group Because there are lots of folks who used to be here, now they're there. Mike Davidson works with them. They're not allowed to come out. Oh, no. No, you're not allowed. Everyone else can come out, but you can't. And again, I say stop. That's discrimination. Either let everyone out or else admit that you too discriminate.
Why is it that if a man feels that he doesn't want to be a man and wants to identify as a woman, that's fine, and the NHS will align itself towards that individual finding expression as a woman, even though his gender of birth was male? And we see in society, I believe, a 4,000% increase in the number of children who are identifying as trans in society after we've become, increasingly aware of the so-called trans agenda. So there's an inconsistency. We're prepared to accept those rights and those freedoms, but if a man is struggling with his homosexual feelings, we have a problem with him getting help, or of him saying, I'm no longer gay. If we talk about ex-gay or people who were once gay who want to leave homosexuality, that seems to be deeply offensive to the LGBT community.
The government planned to introduce Relationships and Sex Education, or RSE, as a compulsory part of school curriculums across the UK in 2020, in which LGBTQ issues are likely to be taught to children, has aroused major concern from many parents who hold religious or conservative beliefs.
Where is the public crisis for this? What has happened that has resulted in schools having to enforce this on children? What has happened?
So
are we opening our front doors and people are dying? What has happened that this needs to be done?
Exactly that. We're living in the craziest world and we need to bring people together this time, not push people apart. And I think teaching children about all the different types of families that are out there. You've got a man living down the road raising his daughters on his own. No one's batting an eyelid, but you put two men together and there seems to be an issue.
Several campaigns have been launched in order to push back against this government's plan.
So about 18 months ago, I started looking into RSE, the government's plan to make relationship and sex education compulsory in schools here in England. I started doing some deeper research into it because I wanted to understand where this kind of thinking and idea came from. And then I came across, it's an international movement actually that's aiming to get something called comprehensive sexuality education into all schools worldwide by the year 2030. It's actually currently being pushed by the United Nations. So I looked a lot into that and I could see direct links and direct parallels between this curriculum and what's happening here in the UK, which is deeply, deeply disturbing. It's introducing basically various liberal secular ideologies to do with sexuality into our schools and into our curriculums.
At primary school, the focus is on teaching children about the diversity of relationships and family structures. So by the time they get to secondary school, then they have the idea that it's completely natural, it's completely normal. So then the teaching becomes much more sexual, because after children have reached puberty, then naturally they're going to start experimenting.
For me, it's a real problem that teaching LGBT issues to children who are pre-pubescent. Children are concrete thinkers. They are taught 2 men or 2 women can love each other, settle down, have a family, whatever. Well, they are concrete thinkers, so they go, and in terms of child development, they know little boys can't stand little girls at that age, little girls can't stand little boys, it's the ooh yuck factor. So they go, oh, well, I love my best friend, guess what, I must be gay. And that is what we are hearing. Children are taking a wrong message because children do not process things intellectually, emotionally, whatever. They are not adolescents. Adolescents are not adults.
RE is about relationship education. It is only to teach the children. This is compulsory from 2020, and It is to teach young children about the family structures that exist in the society. Almost in every school, may that be a minority, but there might be a child coming with two parents who are both of the same sex, so two fathers or two mothers.
The introduction of RSE allegedly comes as a step to educate young children about difference and diversity, in hope that it will put an end to the bullying and discrimination faced by LGBTQ children or those who have LGBTQ families.
I think that is the argument they're using, that LGBT children are bullied, therefore we have to teach children to be inclusive. That argument in itself is okay, and actually as Muslims, we don't condone discrimination or bullying, but actually you can teach children tolerance in a very broad way by teaching them skills of compassion, respect for difference. However, in my opinion, this is a complete Trojan horse. It's the way of the LGBT agenda getting into schools to promote their ideology, and that is what we are actually seeing in schools. Because they're not just teaching it as an anti-bullying issue, they're actually pushing to promote it. And by their very own admission, they want to, quote, smash heteronormativity. What that means is they want to kind of erode the assumption that the majority of us are heterosexual. They're not actually going to be satisfied until they've got that normative status in society.
I think it's important that we learn from a very young age to respect other human beings. So I think this particular education, and specifically although it is for a minority, I think it should be extended, and the kids should be taught how to respect other human beings despite of the differences. So for that reason, we are promoting this education.
I was actually talking to a Christian headmaster, and he was saying it just needs to be dealt with at the level of bullying. They don't have to make this big issue about LGBT. All bullying should be stopped. And actually research shows that the main factor of bullying in schools is down to difference, and that could be social economic class, it could be race, it could be being overweight. And actually these issues where children are being bullied are actually being minimised because the LGBT are actually taking over that area.
So for example, this is a book that has been used in other campaigns. It does come across, initially by default, when you see a book which says, "and tango makes three," instantly you think it's teaching some kind of a nature of homosexuality and all that. But this is a true story that happened in New York, where two penguins raised a chick who obviously couldn't lay an egg and hatch an egg. But I recommend that parents should try and get a copy just to understand the type of stories that have been formulated.
Roy and Silo were both boys, but they did everything together. They bowed to each other and walked together. They sang to each other and swam together. Wherever Roy went, Silo went too. They didn't spend much time with the girl penguins, and the girl penguins didn't spend much time with them. Instead, Roy and Silo wound their necks around each other. Their keeper, Mr. Gramsay, noticed the two penguins and thought to himself, they must be in love. Roy and Silo watched how the other penguins made a home, so they built a nest of stones for themselves. Every night, Roy and Silo slept there together, just like the other penguin couples. And every morning, Roy and Silo woke up together. But one day, Roy and Silo saw that the other couples could do something they could not. The mama penguin would lay an egg.
The problem is, you see, that many young people experience these feelings, same-sex attraction, which is often transitory. But at the moment, they're being encouraged to attach on themselves a sexual identity, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and now transgender. And that's a real problem, because children, teenagers, they're fixing onto themselves a label which then they think they've got to carry on through life. And often when you set your course of life in a particular direction, especially with sexual activity, which can be addictive, then it becomes a lifestyle which is very hard to get out of.
Parents from a school in Birmingham held weeks of protests against what they felt was a breach of their parental and religious rights. The Birmingham school introduced a special program called No Outsiders, which was to consist of a series of lessons that include children's books about same-sex parents. The protests received significant media attention and sparked national debate about the conflict of rights between these two minority communities.
They've allowed parents to think that parents tell schools what to do, and parents tell schools which books they can have, which books they can't have, what they can say, what they can't say.
Religion itself is a protected characteristic under the equalities legislation, but it is important that in school, children are growing up knowing about modern Britain, knowing about the country in which they're going to become adults.
I think the main concern is, firstly, parents had no idea that this was happening, and I've had, again, so many parents telling me that their children are coming home. A little girl of 5 was told that her teacher told her she could marry her best friend of the same gender. Now, this is going completely against our religious rights as parents to bring our children up in line with our beliefs, which actually is a fundamental international human right. That is causing problems on multiple levels. Not only is it confusing children because the parent's saying one thing and the teacher's saying another. And, teachers are positions of authority, so children are going to listen to what they're saying, and not all children are going to tell their parent what their teachers are saying. We've also got stories of boys coming home, again, their teachers saying it's okay to be a girl. This is confusing on a completely another level. Not only is it, again, against the parents' right to bring up their children in line with their beliefs and values, it's against scientific reason, logic, and all these things, and it's actually going to cause psychological damage to young children who can't actually understand those concepts. And it's overloading their neural networks with too much information that they can't process, and that will cause neural damage that can lead to anxiety, depression, and God knows what else kind of later on in life. So it's highly dangerous, and parents have every right to be concerned.
My child was being shown posters about 2 mums, 2 dads. I don't agree with that. Why should my child, before he's actually learned about how he came into the world, already be taught that he could possibly have 2 mums or 2 dads?
But is he being taught that?
It's not true.
But he
it's
hasn't.
not honest.
It's not honest because it's the reality of families today.
Why should my child
I'm
adjust
not
my
asking
life
you to adjust your life.
Your child should attend those classes. My child doesn't need to.
Sure.
Yeah.
RSE is also introducing kind of sexual concepts to children in the classroom. They want basically strangers to teach your child about their private parts. That is wrong on so many levels. And not only are they doing that, they're making it compulsory. So parents have no right, to teach your child about safeguarding their body relationships, sexual relationships at the appropriate time. It's a preserve of the parent and the family, not the state and the school. And it feels like a massive totalitarian endeavour, actually, with the state taking over the role of the parent.
Aren't you discriminating against the LGBT community?
No,
you're doing exactly what you're saying is happening to you.
No, I think that is a lot of misconceptions. What the parents are saying is we feel that any community, whether it's LGBT, whether it's Muslim, whether you're religious faith, that we should be able to live and coexist with one another, even if we have different beliefs or different views.
A lot of parents are afraid to speak out because they're afraid of being labelled as homophobic. Now, to be considered homophobic, you have to clearly kind of be discriminatory and demonstrate hate speech, and I don't think any of us are doing that. We really just want to state our religious rights and beliefs as parents.
Would you say you were a tolerant man?
Personally, unfortunately, in the media, I've been made out to be this homophobic, crazy sort of man.
But you did say, let me quote your own words back to you, it plants a seed in them.
Yeah, so
what seed does it plant?
Okay, so if you give me an opportunity to clarify that, parents feel that at the primary school age, the child is not of an age to understand such complex relationships such as LGBT, or even some heterosexual relationships, or even about Islam or religion and stuff. And parents feel that in primary school we should be teaching our children about humanity, respect for humanity. Parents at the school shouldn't feel like the school is over-promoting one narrative and not the other, and we should try to make...
What is clear is that modern liberalism has failed in its claim that it's a kind of vessel in which many cultures can coexist. It seems that modern liberalism is not simply a neutral system of organising. It actually means that all cultures, beliefs, and points of view are secondary to our primary commitment as detached liberal agents. Practices of toleration that used to be seen as essential to freedom are being dismissed as structures of repression and any ideas or beliefs that stand in the way of this process are banned from public discourse. Instead, a hyper-liberal ideology has developed that aims to purge society of any trace of other views of the world. The policing of opinion is now established practice in the very societies that believe themselves to be freer than they have ever been.
Philip Schofield, the presenter who usually helps guests share part of their lives with viewers, instead today shared a part of his, revealing that he is gay. A statement read today by his co-host, Holly Willoughby.
The strength and support of my wife and my daughters, I've been coming to terms with the fact that I am gay.
A revelation he made after 27 years of marriage to his wife, Stephanie Lowe, to whom he paid tribute today.